Greetings to you wherever you are in the world. My name is Wendy Osborne, Senior Consultant with IAVI, and on behalf of IAVI and the Emirates Foundation, I am delighted to welcome you to this session number 6 in our virtual Global Forum series. We are delighted to have had over 1,300 people register for the series from over 90 countries. The COVID-19 pandemic has emphasised how volunteers as agents of change provide the practical action that builds hope and resilience, improves lives and strengthens communities. The pandemic resulted in the postponement of the October 2020 IAVI World Volunteer Conference to be hosted by the Emirates Foundation in Abu Dhabi. The conference will now be held in the autumn of 2021. However, the conference theme chosen for 2020 of volunteering together to enable change and create a better world has never been more relevant or more real. As part of the preparations for the conference, the Emirates Foundation had agreed to support the writing of 7 context papers on the conference sub-themes. Although the conference has been postponed, this project has continued. It aims to provide opportunity for greater consideration of important issues, including with relevance to volunteering and COVID-19, and to enable wider dissemination of knowledge that will add value to those supporting and developing volunteering around the world. The context papers will be published and available between July and December 2020, and the publication of each of these papers is aligned to the series of virtual global forums. I would like to pay tribute to Dr. Chris Allen and Dr. Peter Devereux, the authors of the context paper associated with today's forum. It is an excellent piece of work and I commend it to you. We hope the forums will be of interest to volunteer involving organisations, academics, policymakers, corporations and volunteers. A copy of the relevant published paper will be provided to each person who registers for a forum, and following each webinar, the paper and the forum recording will be made available to anyone interested. If you missed any of the previous webinars, please go online to access the information. Now to some technical information. On the screen, you will see an overview of the meeting room controls. There are 2 points to highlight. If you're having trouble with your computer's audio, try using your phone by selecting phone call under the audio tab. Most importantly, there will be a question and answer session as part of this forum. So send in your questions by using the questions tab. No need to wait to pose questions. You can write them at any time. As I said, this is a forum series, and we are now almost at the end with the final webinar scheduled for the 9th of December. Today's forum is on the topic of measurement and impact, providing the evidence that volunteering is good for society and good for you. The issue of wanting to understand the impact we make is not new. I have never met a volunteer who was not interested in the difference they were making, as to make a difference is the reason they were volunteering. However, there is no doubt that over the years, the drive to measure the impact of volunteering, particularly formally, has grown. So the questions of what, why, and how have become ever more relevant. What are we measuring? Why is it important? And how can we do it effectively? The topic is globally important, and today's forum and the accompanying context paper will add to the discussion and our understanding of the issues. I am therefore delighted that today's moderator comes with the right experience and expertise to lead us through the rest of the forum. Jean Tan is the Executive Director of the Singapore International Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to international peace building and development. She has served at the Ministries of Manpower, Foreign Affairs and Information and the Arts. She is a graduate of the National University of Singapore and was awarded the Singapore Government Merit Scholarship to pursue postgraduate studies in the United States. In her spare time, Jean volunteers on the board of the International Forum on Development Service, a global network of volunteer-driven development agencies, and chairs its annual conference committee. She also serves on the Global Public Diplomacy Network as a founder board member and on the board of SG Enable, an agency dedicated to serving persons with disabilities. Finally, I take this opportunity on behalf of IAVI and the Emirates Foundation to thank you, Jean, and our other distinguished panel members for your input today. I know this is going to be a great session. It is now over to you.
Thank you, Wendy, and to IAVE for this opportunity. Hello and welcome everyone to today's forum on measuring the impact of volunteering. Whether you're here as a volunteer or volunteer manager, a funder or host agency, whether you do national or international volunteering, this topic is an important one. How do we know that we're making a positive difference in someone's lives and sustainably solving social issues? How do we differentiate what we do from other forms of development work and demonstrate our unique value add that justifies sustainable funding? Thankfully, we have a global panel of experts with us today who will provide you with some answers and more food for thought. I like that we will have the perspectives of both academics and practitioners in this discourse. As our audience, I urge you to tap into this rich resource and ask questions. Please type in your questions in the Q&A box and we'll try to address as many concerns as possible. Cliff and Peter, our researchers, will kick off with a presentation on the context paper they wrote. Our panelists, who are primarily practitioners, will respond, sharing their experience from the UK to Russia to Hong Kong. Regrettably, Magdalena from Chile's America Solidara is unable to join us today. Following the panel discussion, we'll open the session to the floor for discussion. Along the way, we'll also conduct some polls to get audience feedback. So to kick off, I'd like to introduce the authors of the context paper. Dr. Cliff Alum is an associate fellow at the Third Sector Research Centre in the University of Birmingham, UK. He was also the CEO of Skillshare International and president of the International Forum for Volunteering and Development. So Cliff brings on an academic's rigor and the rich practical experience of a practitioner to this topic. Dr. Peter Devereux is from Down Under, where he is coordinator of the SDG unit he started at Curtin University. Peter has focused on volunteering for development and sustainability policy, research, and practice for 30 years. He publishes and presents extensively in this area. Currently, he's leading a longitudinal study on Australia's volunteers. Peter and Cliff, please share with us why impact measurement is important and easy to do.
Thanks, Jean. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to start, then Peter's going to say a few words, and then I'm going to finish off. So please bear with us. We'll try and make it as seamless as we can. We're really delighted to produce our paper on measurement and impact of volunteering for IAVE, and we're also delighted to have the opportunity of presenting it at this webinar. Can we go to the next slide, please? This presentation is about how volunteering organisations can approach measurement and impact as part of normal practice and to make it simple and appropriate. I think we're both conscious this can be a really complex issue and presented in very complicated ways. So we're going to try and make it as simple as we can. We cover some of the issues in greater depth in our paper, and we've also written in other papers on this subject, so please feel free to go through our back catalogue and see what we said before. But we hope it's consistent. So there's plenty of opportunity for you to follow up on these issues. If you take a moment just to look at that quote that we put on the slide, which is a little bit about measurement and what volunteering is about. Put it simply, defining volunteering is subject to a lot of debate. Typically involves free will and giving time for the benefit of others. But various models have been developed and refined, so we see various dimensions of volunteering rather than just one. It could be paid over unpaid. It could be free will over coercion. It could be benefiting others over yourself. Some writers argue these are better considered on a spectrum rather than an either-or choice. So these broader definitions can extend to issues such as mutual aid and self-help, formal service delivery, civic engagement and campaigning. So it's quite a big area to look at. When we consider impact, we really need to focus on benefits both for volunteers and for society. So we think it's worth looking at two key questions when considering impact and how you measure it. The first question is, how does the volunteer experience impact on the volunteer personally and influence their future opportunities and behavior? Can you click through? Thank you. And how do volunteers, second question, how do volunteers impact the aspirations and needs of the communities where they volunteer? So two aspects to this. What's the impact on the volunteer? What impact does the volunteer have? And it's important to be clear which question you want to answer, because from this, further questions emerge. For example, are there objectives set for volunteers or volunteer programs? If so, who sets them? If not, how do we know how to measure impact? So we'll leave those questions for you to think about for the moment. So we suggest looking at measuring impact at three different levels. And this is a very summary way of looking at it. Firstly, just ask. What do we mean by that? Well, any organization can simply ask volunteers about their experience, their satisfaction in their activity and the organization, what difference this is making in their lives to be a volunteer. Such an approach could be formal or informal, could be used to assist organizational understanding or learning, or to improve support provided to the volunteer, or it could be used to generate promotional material that helps recruit other volunteers. But it is quite simple, just ask. The second one has popped up, that's just survey. And this is, if you like, the next level, going beyond that, asking your volunteers about their experiences. This is where organizations are looking to gain insights by comparing volunteering experiences, either for their own knowledge or to demonstrate achievements to other stakeholders. A more formal approach tends to be involved here using surveys, and that can be useful and can help with engaging with a larger number of volunteers. Electronic surveys using multiple choice or open-ended questions can be used, such as SurveyMonkey. The third level you might want to look at is just research. If you're in an organization with more resources, then taking on a research project could be a way forward. Maybe for your own organization or as part of a project involving a number of organizations. So it's not just something for large organizations. Small organizations can have opportunities as part of a larger research project. This might involve you typically working with a university research department or research institute. And if you're interested in this, networks such as IAVE can play an important role in guiding you through that process. Now, while a significant body of research on volunteering focuses on the volunteer, when we're looking at measuring impact, there are limitations on relying solely on the self-reported views of volunteers. So validating the results of measuring impact can be undertaken in different ways. Other perspectives than those of the volunteer also have validity, and the opportunity of comparing how different stakeholders view the same situation or reality can provide important insights, indicating where there is shared understanding and where there are differences. This slide shows a simple approach to comparing data sources. In addressing the question of what difference does volunteering make, it compares and contrasts three sources of data shown in those three different boxes to build a picture of what difference volunteering makes. It looks at volunteer perspectives based on interview surveys. It looks at community perspectives based on interviews or surveys, and organizational reviews and reports. So three different sources of data. An example of an organization that used this approach started by surveying volunteers, and then subsequently decided they wanted the views of the organizations that the volunteers were involved with. And so they introduced a further survey. And then the third step was to compare this with commissioned evaluations of their volunteering activity. So three different sources of data, and that will give you better picture of what difference volunteering is making than if you just rely on the single source of data. Earlier, I raised the question of objectives, which, remember, in one of those questions, do we set objectives, and if so, who sets them? If we intend to measure our achievements, having objectives we are trying to achieve is one way of approaching this. Now, in my experience, funders are especially fond of objectives against which they can measure performance. Although, to be fair, this is not quite the same as measuring impact. So sometimes it's worth considering proxy indicators, such as the level of inputs, and you will find that donors or funders will say, we will look at how much work you are doing as an indicator, a proxy indicator for impact. For example, you could count the number of volunteer teachers on the assumption from different experiences that teachers will have some impact on the education of their pupils. So the impact is assumed, but the scale is used as an indicator of the impact. You could look at this from the other end. There are always unintended consequences of our actions. So there will be unintended or unanticipated impacts on volunteers and on the places and communities where they volunteer. So rather than have objectives, or as well as having objectives, another approach is one that looks back and explores what we have achieved in terms of impact. And that also has value. Now, when we look at objectives, many organizations concerned with volunteering are now focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals as a way of addressing the contribution of volunteers. And Peter is now going to take us through that. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Cliff. And great to be able to share with people today or tonight or this morning, depending on where you are. I wanted to connect what Cliff has started with a global framework that connects what volunteers do with what is part of a global agenda that was agreed by member states of the United Nations in 2015, and a framework that goes till 2030 and has as an objective to give a direction and a way of measuring progress towards sustainable development through looking at specific goals, and you can see the 17 goals on the screen if you're not already aware of them, that link to issues like health and education, gender equality, clean energy, climate action, inequality, partnerships, as well as issues like protecting life on land and life under the water in terms of biodiversity. But it's also a particularly interesting framework for people thinking about measuring the contribution of volunteering, because as part of the development of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, there was an explicit recognition that the 17 goals would not be achieved without the contribution of volunteers to it. And so that's why it's a particularly helpful frame of reference for volunteers and for people wanting to show the impact and the contribution of volunteering. It also is something that actually lends itself to a bit of fun, and at a conference that I was at, we were able to use a spinning wheel to get volunteers to have fun and win prizes by writing down how their volunteer activities connected with the SDG that came up when they spun the wheel. We had a lot of fun with that, and it really engaged people who perhaps before the conference had engaged in their volunteer work but hadn't seen it as part of that global framework. So as countries around the world start to measure their own contributions to Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, they have increasingly included in the reports they've shared with the United Nations and with member states about what they're doing. They've shared as part of those the contribution of volunteers to implementation of the goals. And that's not just in low-income countries, but also in middle and high-income countries. And there were examples of those presented as part of the State of the World's Volunteering report, the most recent one. But each year, when the reports come in for the General Assembly in the middle of the year each year, then there are increasingly, since 2017, 2018, 2019, now 2020, there's been increasing numbers of countries reporting the importance of volunteer action as part of what their country has achieved. And so what this means is, as you can see from this circle on the right-hand side, that in a sense we can potentially, through the action of volunteers, gauge a contribution to a virtuous cycle where volunteers actually take action and build a sense of contribution towards the Sustainable Development Goals in specific ways, but then they also actually attract diverse stakeholders to that endeavour. So as part of their work, they're not just doing things, but they're also increasing the scope for others to engage, people that might not have been engaged otherwise, but they're their friends, colleagues, family. And that brings in an opportunity for greater support for that work. But it also means, with a more diverse group of volunteers doing the work and doing the action and being actively engaged, that it inspires new opportunities for new partnerships that then again creates new opportunities for new volunteers to engage. And that again provides an opportunity to get greater volunteer contributions recognised by institutions, including by funders, but also in the community, to see the really critical role that volunteers can make. And so the Sustainable Development Goals and that measurement angle can really provide a really key contribution to that. And where organisations have taken that up, it immediately gives information, evidence to their country when it seeks to prepare its voluntary national review on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So one example of this that was really simple that we did in Western Australia in 2017 with a group of volunteer managers was we did a very simple thing. We sent out a survey monkey to all of the volunteer managers engaged through Volunteering Western Australia, and we asked them about the work that the volunteers they were working with were doing against the different Sustainable Development Goals. And then we brought those volunteer managers together to talk about those contributions. And it became immediately obvious from the results of that Survey Monkey and the workshop that actually there were some really significant contributions across just about all of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so immediately there was a real opportunity to show the contribution of volunteering to the Sustainable Development Goals. We started that, again, in quite a simple way. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. We asked people to do an initial self-assessment of their own organisation, the people they were working with, and their contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And this gave people a real opportunity to engage with a framework that a lot of them were not aware of before that. But it also made an opportunity for a collective sense of, when we got people together, we were able to present back to them the results from the survey of what people individually felt their organisations and volunteers were doing, and people could collectively see the power of that volunteer action across at a statewide level. And that was really powerful, not just in demonstrating to others the importance of that work towards a whole range of different Sustainable Development Goals, not just perhaps the ones that individual groups or organisations might be working towards, but a whole range of them. But it also showed a great synergy across many goals, where a lot of volunteer organisations and volunteer effort was actually contributing to multiple goals at the same time and simultaneously. And so that showed the real practical benefits to volunteer managers of why connecting and measuring their volunteer impact on a global framework that could be measured locally was worth doing. And that in itself provided a really powerful opportunity to take this new framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, and use it as a way to put volunteering more on the map, both with funders, with governments, but also with individual volunteers and those working together with volunteers. So the last thing is that obviously this endeavour that we did, getting managers together and looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, was an initial effort to try and get it on the radar, get people thinking about it. It was relatively unsophisticated, but quite impactful nevertheless. But taking that from that level, there's an opportunity as well for people to then move from that, and Cliff talked about the highest level that can go to as well, where you might engage with researchers to actually help you document in much more detail what's happening. But also there's a couple of simpler ways that also organisations and volunteers can engage and document what they're doing through impact assessment toolkits. And I mentioned a couple on this slide. One that's this volunteer impact assessment toolkit developed by the UK Institute for Volunteering Research. And that has been something that's really been effectively used. It's a toolkit that has to be purchased, but there's a really systematic and simple way that then people, once they have it, can work through it. And there's an example in the paper that we've produced from the Gaelic Women's Football Association that shows with a very simple traffic light system the effectiveness of their volunteer work through the Gaelic Women's Football Association and the power of that. A separate example that I've also given is the 2030 Agenda Toolbox that draws on guidance from a whole range of different entities, including civil society organisations like IAVE and others, as well as governments and other entities, international organisations, the private sector. And the toolkit that the UN volunteers help bring together gives a whole range of tools that people can access themselves as a way to measure and work through systematic processes to get a sense of the volunteer contribution and its impacts. And if we have a chance in the question time, I know we might be able to hear also from our panel, because when we spoke last week, we were hearing some interesting examples, for example, from a very current example under the COVID-19 situation, where Volunteering Matters have done an impact assessment of the volunteer contributions in the midst of the COVID pandemic. And there might be a chance to hear a bit about that later on as a really recent and concrete example of also how people can document and the power of doing that for then demonstrating the power of the volunteer work. With that, I'll hand back to Cliff. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. I found that really interesting as well. So thank you. I'm thinking what I would like to do is to draw this to conclusion so we can get the opportunity of having some of the other panel members say a few words. My suggestion from the outset for any volunteering organisation is to think of measuring impact as a learning journey. And this is true in a number of ways. I think it's important to think about what works for your organisation and will meet what you are really interested in. For example, do you want to know about the impact on volunteers? If so, are you interested in specific areas of impact? For example, future pathways or mental health. Or do you want to know about the impact of volunteer contributions in an organisation or a community? So first suggestion would be try to be clear about your priorities. The second thing is whether it's cost effective to do what you want to do. So it's important to take the time to decide what is a benefit or interest and what resources, including staff time, volunteer time, you are able to commit. So don't try to do everything. Peter's just talked about the question of toolkits, and one of the things is, can you access and use a toolkit? More broadly, can you use approaches that other people have already developed? You don't have to reinvent the wheel. The toolkits are out there, and before you start, get support and advice. Use your volunteer networks. Use other network members to support you before you start and afterwards. It's an ongoing process, and if you can share and discuss with other members, other network members of IAVE, or if you could other organizations that you are aware of, then you can find out and learn a lot more, and you don't have to, as it were, make the same mistakes that everyone else makes when they're starting out. And finally, have you thought about organizational buy-in and the impact on working time? Do you have the buy-in from staff and volunteers and communities your organization works with? I think it's certainly my experience that an organization might think about wanting to do measurement of impact and sets out with some really technical approaches and and nobody else really knows what's going on. Nobody else really thinks that's a great idea. I've been there, and you don't have to do it that way. It's important that people see the point of how you are measuring impact, and it's important they will get to see and share in their findings. I thought what was really nice about Peter's example was the way he described how volunteers participated in the process and learned through the process of understanding what the impact was of engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals. It was there, it was visual, they could see it and they could engage with it. So the meaning was important. I think finally, in that sense, building ownership for shared benefits is as vital, important, as well as trying to secure your required outcomes. I think that's all from us. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope you found the presentation and the paper of interest. Thanks. You can find us at the email addresses below, and with that, back to Jean.
Thank you, Cliff and Peter. Not just for sharing the challenges we face in measuring impact, but also highlighting various organizational practices and ways of approaching measurement and evaluation we could adopt. I agree that measuring impact is best seen as a learning journey. Now I'd like to do a reality check with our first audience poll. Jessica, if you could help me out here. I would like to ask you how often your organization evaluates the impact of volunteering. So you have 30 seconds to select your answer. So do you measure impact frequently or only when asked by your funder? Is it a continuous process? Please let us know your response. Okay, so we have about 180 of you here online right now, and I think about 67% of you answered the question or voted. And it looks like the most common answer is occasionally. And some of you say it's a continuous process. So I think if you add up frequently and continuous, it looks like it is a good practice and a healthy majority of you actually do so. Any reactions to the poll, Peter or Cliff? Is this good or should we do better?
Well, just very quickly, should we do better? Well, that's a question. It's a question for me. It's a question of whether we're doing what's appropriate for us as an organisation. So it may be entirely appropriate that you do measurement of impact occasionally, because that may be a resource question. It may be entirely relevant and appropriate to do that, and it may be entirely appropriate that you do it continually because that's embedded in your systems and you can make that part of your features. But essentially what I was looking at there was it splits rather 50-50 between those that do it rarely and occasionally on the one hand, and those that do it frequently, continually, and on demand by donors on the other. And I think that was, in a sense, it gives an indication that across volunteering organizations, there's a wide spectrum of practice in measuring impact, but that doesn't mean to say that any of those practices are inappropriate. It may be, its question is, are they fit for purpose for your organization? And that's the one question you really have to ask.
I'll now like to turn to our panel members for their responses to the presentation and also to share their own experience on the topic. First, we will have Paul Reddish. He is the CEO of Volunteering Matters, which supports over 100 volunteering programs throughout the UK, involving some 30,000 volunteers. They spearheaded social change in critical areas like isolation, loneliness, skills development, youth social action, and the improvement of mental health and well-being. Paul is also currently chairing the National Volunteering Coordination Response, made up of key leaders from across both government and the voluntary sector.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or evening, wherever you are. I'm going to give you a whistle-stop 5-minute tour of Volunteering Matters impact and what's happened subsequently since COVID. Volunteering Matters set its stall out over the 60 years in its existence in the UK as being a leader in policy and practice in volunteering. But recently we've been on a slightly different journey. And it's a question I've pushed really hard in the organisation, which is, not taking that leadership role in volunteering for granted, not talking in an echo chamber to other people that understand the value of volunteering, and really challenging ourselves to start to articulate why and what and how volunteering has an impact on communities. And that has become what our new strategy is about. Volunteering has become the tool by which we do it, and we have expertise and leadership in that. But it really doesn't matter unless we can demonstrate the impact that that has on communities and the people that operate in communities. And when we went on that journey, we started, instead of talking about the number of programs we ran and the number of volunteers that existed and some of the objectives and deliverables, we started talking about outcomes, and some of them were mentioned in this slide around, we support the reduction in social isolation, we improve health, and a number of other things. And then critically underpinning that, we said, and actually what we really want to do is empower and enable communities to have a voice and a role and an influence on what happens in their place. And what that does when you do that, it completely changes the role of your organization. Rather than being a top-down programmatic, we know about volunteering, we'll keep you safe and we'll have a program, we'll deliver outcomes. All of a sudden you're asking the question of your volunteers, well, what is it that matters in your place and community in relation to isolation? And what can we do to support you to achieve change in your community? And then our job becomes one of getting the funding for that, facilitating the programmatization of that work, and collecting the results and impact, but really leaving the power with the communities and the volunteers that are involved. And interestingly, having gone through that change going into COVID, it did something quite amazing. Overnight, all of these sort of programmatic responses had to stop. We couldn't do the face-to-face contact that we had in many cases. But rather than looking at that as a bit of a disaster, what our volunteers did, because they'd already been empowered by the organisation, was really embrace how can we still address the issues in our community in light of the COVID restrictions. And we saw people repurposing what they did from, previously having a mentoring relationship between sort of our volunteers and our care leavers. All of a sudden, those relationships were being used where older people were isolating to deliver shopping. Or together they were out doing things in the community and still building that relationship through volunteering. We saw new focus coming out of different projects. We saw our youth social action projects producing family packs for children that were stuck at home with no opportunity to learn, and they were producing peer-led materials to help support people that weren't getting the opportunities from education because of a chaotic family environment. And then we saw some scaling, which was really interesting. We saw things like choirs and knitting groups and various other things move to an online space. And we had a project in Brighton where there were 40 or 50 older people we were working with. They went onto an online space, and before we knew it, we were getting people joining from Cardiff and Milton Keynes and Newcastle and other parts of the country. And all of a sudden, we were reaching 10 times the people we were before. So we had an online space to be able to sort of address the isolation issues. And I think for me, COVID's been really interesting in highlighting what the art of the possible is if actually you see your role as empowering communities and volunteers to address the real needs in front of them. And then you provide the structure and confidence and ability for them to step forward and do that. And perhaps after this conference, we'll be able to share our impact report, which starts to talk about some of these instances in which we've been able to make real change in challenging conditions. I hope that's given you a good insight of our approach to impact and what it's meant during COVID. And I'm very happy to take any questions as we get to that point in the session.
Thank you, Paul. Next, we have Diana Jalalova, who is the Deputy Chairman of the Council of the Russian Association of Volunteer Centers. The AVC is the largest volunteer agency in Russia and it mobilizes more than 1 million volunteers around the country. There are some 125 organizations around AVC. Diana, you've been devoted to the development of infrastructure to support volunteering in Russia. How has impact measurement factored in that?
Thank you, Jean. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good day, and good evening, as a previous speaker said. Nice to be here. Thank you all for listening. So, and as a representative of the organization which works all over Russia and which has its members all over our big country, we absolutely for sure can say that it is very important for us to measure the impact of volunteering, as we have to plan our activity, we have to plan the development of volunteering in our country by seeing the results of this impact and by seeing the results of different measurements in different spheres. And we absolutely understand here in Russia, in each region, that if we want to see the impact of volunteering, we have to create a real strong system of supporting of volunteering itself as a whole, in whole understanding, and also each volunteer in Russia, which we involve to our projects or who are who initiate their own projects. Over the past 5 years, Association of Volunteer Centers has been developing volunteering at the national level through creating the network of volunteer resource centers throughout the country, organizing grant contests to support volunteer projects and initiatives, forming various standards and materials to help to spread the best experience across the territory of our large country. I mentioned contests, and I can say that on our experience, a great role in measurement of volunteering plays the annual contest we organize each year. The name of this contest is All Russian Contest of Volunteer Initiatives, Volunteer of Russia. This year, for example, we received more than 15,000 applications to this contest in different thematical nominations. There were 14 nominations, and people from 8-year-olds till any year-old could take part at this contest. And when we got those applications, we could understand what are the trends of volunteer activity in our country. For example, this last year, we understood that the biggest attention is going to animals and environment. In 2020, of course, the biggest activity, volunteering activity, was dedicated to fighting COVID-19. And when we find out the spheres of volunteer interests, we understand that our goal is to create opportunities and to create proposals in these spheres for all active people who want to become a volunteer or who want to develop himself in volunteering and try, for example, something new. To avoid losing the volunteer achievements, we created several years ago a system of personal volunteer profiles on our national platform, dobro.com, to collect all activities in a unified format, amount of volunteer hours, results, dynamics of participation of volunteers. So it's also somehow a measurement resource for us. Profile data can be used to earn extra points when applying to the university, for example, for each volunteer who is a future student. So we know that volunteering someday can be chaotic, or it's wheeling from the heart, but we understand that to see the impact, to have the impact on a national level of volunteering, we have to work strongly on creating a strong system of supporting, as I said before. And I have only 1 minute. Finalizing my speech, I want to mention several facts. facts. Volunteers need to understand that their efforts are visible, and it helps us. So when they see that their efforts are visible, then it's also a mechanism to measure somehow by understanding of volunteers itself and by understanding of people whom they help, how the sphere develops. The second point, there have to be realized measures of supporting volunteers, from insurance system to education of volunteers. So when those measures are created and they are really realized, then we also can evaluate and measure the impact of volunteering on volunteers itself. Because we see that not only environment or people or other spheres can be the indicator of volunteering. The volunteer itself can be the indicator of how the volunteering is developed. And the third point I wanted to mention, that proposals for volunteers have to contain two important aspects: result of volunteer activity itself and result for the volunteer itself, his professional and ethical growth. So when we have such proposals which contain the interest in volunteer itself, then when we want to measure something afterwards, we can measure much more by asking volunteers of their view to the life like a volunteer. I'm going to the end of my speech. I want to say that in Russia we counted once that 15 million people name themselves as volunteers. We have 145 million citizens in Russia, and 15 million, they count themselves as volunteers. And we feel our responsibility for these people, and we feel our responsibility for the measurement of impact of volunteering, because thanks to that, we can propose something interesting, new for our citizens who want to be social active. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. That's 15 million people as a force for good. That's excellent. Our final speaker actually hails from Hong Kong. We have Carmen Choi, and she is the Director of Employee Volunteering and Employability at the Standard Chartered Bank. So you get the corporate perspective from her. Carmen also heads up Seeing is Believing, which is the bank's flagship community investment initiative that seeks to eliminate avoidable blindness in Africa, Asia, Middle East, and Latin America. Carmen?
Hi, hello, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon, and also good evening. I'm Carmen from Standard Chartered Bank. So I would like to use the next few minutes to share why it's important for us to measure volunteering of employees, and how we do that, and how we would like our partners to help us on that. There are three main purposes of measuring employee volunteering. The first purpose is to get data for sustainable report or annual reports, and we collect volunteering numbers for that. As is regulatory requirements in many countries to publish an annual sustainability report, or even have it in the annual report. And for that, we need to report the monetary donations and also report donation in kind from the company, which includes volunteering hours, and translate that into equivalent monetary value. And together they form the community investment a company has made. So it's for formal reporting. That's why the numbers need to be accurate and traceable. So we collect the volunteering data over an online system. Our employees can apply for 3 leave days for volunteer each year. So we use so they apply volunteering leave over the leave system, and that online system, that internal system, can track the exact numbers of volunteers and volunteering leave days they claim. And so what we need from our partners to help us on would be, we need them to work with us to define what is volunteering, what can be counted as volunteering, and also provide evidence that our employees have actually volunteered. So, and one of the challenges is that it's very difficult to measure informal volunteering. For example, helping old people in your neighborhood to do shopping in the COVID pandemic. So it's very difficult to have evidence on that. So so it makes our volunteering numbers smaller than actual, but we would like to have a way to measure that. And the second purpose is to measure staff volunteers' response to check our staff engagement level. It's mostly for internal reporting to show the value of a volunteering program to the company. And to do this, we run online surveys from time to time. And we always get very positive feedback, like 90% said they enjoy the experience and 80% of staff volunteers said it's beneficial to their development. It's enough for our internal reporting, but if I have the space, I would like to ask more in-depth questions and understand their views more, which can help us shape our volunteering programs. Very often, we need to use the same set of questions for all countries and all activities. So we can't ask tailored questions for different activities. So it's difficult to get really in-depth insights. So it would be great if our volunteering partners can measure response from the volunteers, from our company, and can give us more insight on what activities our staff enjoy, what activities help them, and what we should invest more in. And the third purpose is to measure the benefits to the community and to compare, so that we can compare the community projects we fund. We support many community projects or charity projects through funding and also through volunteering. We measure the immediate outcome, output, longer term change, and the beneficiaries. This is what we required all the partners to measure. And it's usually easy to measure immediate output outcome, but longer term change is difficult to measure, but is valuable. And it is what we would like to see the most, but it's costly to measure. And also, one of the challenges is how to distinguish the proportion to attribute to volunteers and which part to the donations. And there are also other contributing factors to create the change. So when it comes to reporting the impact of our volunteering, we need to word our messages really carefully and not to overclaim what our staff volunteers have achieved through those programs, which is usually involved multiple contributions, even from a company. So these are some quick sharings from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. So now that we've learned from our panelists on what they're measuring and how they're doing it, we'd like to hear from you, our audience, once again. So we have a second poll. So Jessica, if you would put that up, thank you. The question really is, what is the most important data source you have to measure impact? Which one have you used or considered the most important data source to measure impact? Okay, so it looks like the social impact on the ground, also especially how communities have benefited from volunteers is the majority by far, followed by level of activity, I guess the output in terms of numbers. Stories are also important. There's less work done in terms of research studies and evaluations. And surprisingly for me, how volunteers have benefited. I wonder if any of the panel members would like to sort of react to the poll results, or Cliff, Peter, Any surprises?
I think it's
Certainly 1% is low. Sorry, Carmen, I cut you off.
No.
yeah,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, 1% to me, in terms of how volunteers have benefited, really surprised me. I think for me, I think I've seen a transition from an area where people said, oh, volunteers shouldn't get any benefit. It shouldn't be part of the equation, maybe 10, 15 years ago, to now a sense of we accept that one of the distinctive elements of volunteering to some extent is the sense of reciprocal benefit, that you make a contribution, but you also get something in terms of your own well-being. And in a sense, that's one of the things that keeps volunteers motivated to continue to engage. And so it's really interesting to me that in that survey, out of 170 people or whatever, only 1% said that was part of the equation. So that's really interesting, I think. Thanks. Back to you, Carmen.
Thanks. I was trying to say I'm not surprised that the most popular choices are volunteer number of volunteers and also benefits to the communities, because this is quite consistent with how our company measure volunteering. I'm also a bit surprised of the that people don't care so much on the benefits to the volunteers, because it's kind of give us for us is if our employees volunteers, they don't feel they can get some kind of benefits, not because of the benefits, but is part of the equation. If they don't get it, then we don't get, for us it's don't get, we won't get the license to run a volunteering program.
Can I just add those
No,
comments? I just think one of the interesting ones, because I agree, I'm not too surprised about these bigger numbers, because these might reflect what donors are asking or what boards of organizations might ask. These are the kinds of things that they would report on. I thought was really interesting was the 15% that regarded the most important source as stories. I thought that was really interesting, because stories are a really important source of enabling people to understand what happens around volunteering and what volunteers do. So I thought 15% that's a really interesting number.
As in, it wasn't higher? You expected it to be higher?
I think that's high. To say that's the most important source in an era where donors ask not for all sorts of numbers and outcomes against objectives and so forth, to have stories at 15%, I think was surprisingly high in some senses, but encouragingly high. I think that stories are great. Stories are a great way of understanding and having meaning to what volunteering is happening in your organization.
Paul or Dana, do you have anything you want to add?
Just, I mean, what I would say is that these questions have to have context, right, as well. So, and we ask people to vote on one. I mean, essentially, you'd use all in different circumstances and scenarios, and it really sort of depends on what purpose you're trying to achieve. For me, it just links back to why is the most important. So, why do you exist? What is it that you're trying to achieve through the act of engaging people, and that will guide what's most important for an organization. I think sometimes we can get a little bit trapped in what funders want and need, because in a way that's the thing that keeps us sustained, so we can do the why. But it's really important we stay focused on mission and understand what the difference is we're trying to make, whether it be for volunteers or communities or everything else, and then all the other things can hang off that. And I think over time you can get a bit adrift on these things, and I think the best charities have a single focus with a couple of things underneath it, and then everything hangs off that. So that would be my reflection. It's more context that's important.
Okay, Diana, did you want? Yes.
I just wanted to add about benefits for volunteers. I wanted to propose to share the experience much more often between each other because, for example, in our country, we have the list of 200 benefits for volunteers from different spheres. And it is really interesting to understand what are the benefits at your countries, because it's really hard questions. Should be benefits for volunteers, or it's just an activity from heart? Doing our activity, we understand that growth of volunteer movements sometimes really depends on these benefits, and it's very hard to divide which benefits are like material or something and not should be in volunteer world, and which benefits, like for example free university study is a good for volunteer for his development. So that's a great thing that we all discussed that. Thank you very much again.
Great. Thank you all for sharing. We do have some questions from the floor, and maybe we should get to that. So we have Volunteers Pakistan, who actually has more of a comment, but I think maybe therein a question for us. Volunteers Pakistan is the national platform of Pakistan. He says we have a challenge when international NGOs work in Pakistan and they do so to further their agenda rather than focusing on the grassroots community, meaning, I guess, the impact on the community. How can you help to address this situation? Maybe then it's an ask of the people who measure. How do you then perhaps better articulate the value of your volunteering or the value of your cooperation with local NGOs and local volunteering agencies?
I'm happy to have a first go at that one. I can do it in a national local context, maybe not an international national context, but if I think about the conditions in the UK, and I mentioned in my bio, the moment I'm chairing the coordination cell for COVID, which is for volunteering, and underneath that we've got an emergencies partnership which involves all the key organisations responding to COVID, including British Red Cross, St John, and then all the local organisations. And there are huge tensions within the sector around national agency response, a big brand like the British Red Cross and St John Ambulance, and then the local community orgs, and how the two operate together to be able to respond to need in each communities. And in a UK context, there's a constant tension about whether a national organisation should lead or whether it should be led locally, and how the two sit together, and all of these things. So I recognise some of the things you say in a national context, albeit not in an international one. My short answer is it's about relationships, and that really isn't about volunteers. That's about agencies understanding each other's objectives and where they can complement and work together, and giving space for each other. It's an interesting thing as a sector that's quite values-based, as we are. Sort of practicing those values together is not always our strength. And perhaps that's what you're seeing in Pakistan. I certainly recognise it sometimes in parts of the UK. And I think COVID has forced us in some instances to work together more, and it's forged partnerships that weren't there before. So I very much hope one of the benefits that's come out of the pandemic, if I can use that word in the context of a pandemic, is a strengthening of relationships at local and national level that will mean a greater respect for these things going forward.
Thank you, Paul. We have another question that's directed at our researchers. So it says you survey the views of host community and organizations as well as the volunteers' perspective. What about the funder, especially governments who fund international exchange programs? Peter and Cliff, would you like to have a go?
Looks like Peter's leaving this one to me. Yeah, I think the question is within that context is that you would want to talk, you would want to find out what the views are, obviously, of funders and of donors for what they consider they would want to see measured and what they value. It's important to measure. And one of the experiences that we've documented is elsewhere is that at different stages, donors actually prioritize different things. And so that's why it's important to know, because sometimes they want to work on inputs, and then sometimes a little bit later they want to work on outputs and outcomes. And so you're moving between not sure what it is you need to respond to. So it is absolutely important that they're a part of that process of identifying sort of what their requirements are. But I think the starting point has to be, why are you measuring? And what do you want to measure for your organization? And what is important to you as an organization may not be the same as what is important to the donor. And the reason it's important to you sometimes is because it is important to the donor, and then we end up being driven by what the donor wants us to do. So if the donor wants us to have a large volunteer program, we have a large volunteer program because that's what the donor requires. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are doing what we want to do. It doesn't mean to say that we're getting any better at what we want to undertake. It just means we're actually complying with what the donor requires us to do. So there is a dynamic there that we have to look at. And I think what Peter and I were looking at primarily was how do you improve what it is you want to do as an organization by looking at how you measure impact more effectively and safely. So I hope that gives a reflection on that position.
Maybe I can just add to what Cliff's just said as well. Just the other thing I think in an international aid and development context is, there's been a lot of work around development effectiveness over the last 15 or 20 years as well. And there's been a real emphasis in that on not just responding to donor requirements. And there's been much more talk about what's termed mutual accountability or multiple accountabilities, and I think measurement needs to come with that, so that there is an opportunity actually for participants or people that we might talk about as the people that are benefiting, actually saying, well, we get aid for this, but is this what we want? Is this what we need? And certainly in Australia we hear that quite frequently over the last few years in terms of our aid to the Pacific, for example, and it being directed at adaptation against climate change. And a lot of the Pacific leaders have said to Australia, but we want you to not just send your volunteers to help us adapt, we actually want to see Australia cut down its emissions. And so that's part of, in a sense, that sense of measuring at both ends and that sense of mutual accountability that should open up. So good to think about that, and great to have that raised. That was really nice to hear that. And I think it links a bit to what Paul said earlier about their emphasis as an organisation on supporting volunteers in what's important to them. And I think that really fits in an international context. You want to talk to people at the grassroots about what they need and want and find the best ways to do that. Not just be, oh, well, this is what we're funded to do. And that's certainly a really key concern, and something that the International Forum on Volunteering in Development that several of us are involved in really has engaged with a lot over the last 45 years, particularly that sense of an interface between their international volunteers and also what's happening at a national level in countries. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm just mindful of the time, and we have, a couple of minutes left. There is one question I have here that I'd like to put to maybe all our panelists, if you have a view on that, because it asks if we as a sector have in our measurement and evaluation captured well what differentiates our approach from other development approaches. So we're measuring what differentiates us from other development approaches. Any thoughts, views?
And I'll start. I'm sure Peter will happily finish on this one because it's his area really. I mean, this is there is a question then around if we go back to that Sustainable Development Goal example that Peter gave. Then one of the things in there is we have all these areas, education, health, and so forth, and then we can kind of indicate how volunteers might contribute to any of those, and we can try and find out which one of those they're trying to support and so forth. But towards the end of those development goals, there are a couple of process issues in there about which to look at the question of relationship, and that's where the particular distinctive contribution of volunteering comes into play, and that is where the volunteering as in the relationship and with other people and other communities, and as a mechanism for making objectives being effectively delivered. And I think that connects really to what Paul was talking about earlier with his measurement, about how you engage with volunteers to think about how do you address these kind of questions, how can you improve what you do, is recognizing that volunteering has that particular distinctive quality of being able to be an effective mechanism to engage with these issues and processes in a particular way through at community level in a ways that other kinds of mechanisms can't do that. I mean, I think that's recognized quite widely in different ways. I think Carmen would recognize that in the way that her organization wants volunteers to go into communities, recognizing it is distinctive and is important. I think that's where that I would say, and now that becomes possible then to start to look at issues of relationship. There is possibilities to look at how do you measure those sort of social interactions, and you can look at that through approaches such as social capital and so on and so forth. So there are ways of addressing those kinds of questions, and it's really important to do that.
Thank you, Cliff. Does anyone else want to jump in? If not, I'm gonna wrap up given the time. Sorry, yes?
I'll just be very brief and say, look, you know, the deeper you go into the layers of this, the better. And you know, the end of the day, you know, the volunteers by their nature, you know, diverse in skill and experience, but essentially they are either interested in the community of interest or the place they live. And the more we can do to sort of be enablers of that, of the system changes and the social changes in those areas, as opposed to being quite programmatic, that's when we start to get into the really interesting impact and change. And I think that's the opportunity for the sector in a modern context in volunteering, is to recognize, you know, the influence we can have on others to do great things rather than being quite programmatic about it. And that's my hope for volunteering as we move forward, is getting deeper into those layers, much more facilitative in our approach, and interested in what impact that has on a community.
Great, Paul. Thank you for that. So we're almost past our time, so I don't plan on sort of summarizing or wrapping up, but maybe I'll just share some of my quick takeaways. I think what I heard today was in respect to measurement and evaluation is, you know, just ask, just survey, use more than one data source, be clear on what you want, be cost effective, don't do everything, don't reinvent the wheel, use the toolkits that are out there and available. It's important to make volunteer efforts visible. We have sometimes a force of good that's 15 million people. For corporates, data must be traceable and accurate. Partners help provide evidence to corporates. The area of distinction that we need to work on is the relationships that volunteers bring. And the deeper you go into the layers, the better you can measure your impact and change, especially the influence you have on others to do great things. So my thanks to each and every one of you for your generous sharing. We've come to the end of our session, so I'd just like to say thank you to all our panelists, as well to our researchers, and to all our audience for your time and for your participation, active participation. I just need to remind you to mark your calendars for the 9th of December at 9 a.m. ET time. This will be the 7th and the final webinar in the IAVE Global Forum series. The theme is Volunteering 2030. So end your year by tuning in to find out how volunteering is being challenged and changed by new paradigms, shifting social trends and exciting tech innovation. Meantime, stay safe and healthy, From all of us here, goodbye for now.
Good night.